very much for inviting me here today to give my talk. I've changed the title of my presentation to, I guess you people can call me Sheikh, the co-option of Muslim religious figures in public health governance in rural Tanzania. Over the past 2 decades, there have been a growing trend of state agencies co-opting religious leaders in implementation of public health programs in Tanzania. And one could say that this is a global phenomenon starting from the 1990s. I argue that the state process of co-opting religious figures entails a simplification, where some of their roles and identities are amplified and others marginalized to fit project goals. I've divided this talk into 2 parts. In the first part, I give you a sense of how the project imagined these rural religious figures with particular focus on Muslims. And in the second part, I show you how these religious figures evaluate their own roles in relation to the changes that have been in relation to the changes that have been brought by the project. The co-option of Muslim religious figures offers a productive lens to think about biopolitical governance, religion, and the state. So I'll start with my argument about simplification. I'll give you a little bit of background and go quickly to the findings, and in conclusion I'll restate some of the main points. But before I use several key terms that I think need to be quickly defined. I use the term state, and here I mean more than the apparatus of the national government. I look at it more composed of sets of practices, processes, and effects operating at different levels. So I take NGOs, for example, the ones I have investigated, as part of the state. The other term that I use is simplification. I borrow this term from James Scott to refer to forms of control that require narrowing of vision in order to bring certain limited aspects of complex reality into focus. So just think of Muslim religious leaders as these complex figures, and the need to kind of strip off the complexity and ornamentation in order to gain some kind of visibility. The other term that I use is biopolitics, and this comes from Michel Foucault, and I take this to mean new forms of power concerns with population, which takes population as a political, biological, and scientific problem, and intervenes in this problem through technologies of regulation and classification. I think the prime example of these biopolitical projects is these health projects that I'm talking about. Just to give you a quick background how my research ties to existing knowledge and debates, there have been a long history of the role of religious institutions and figures in state and subject formation in sub-Saharan Africa. If you think of Michael Jennings' work with Christian missionaries, however, little has been written about the role of Muslim religious institutions and figures in state health projects. I hope my study makes a contribution in that area. Secondly, ethnographic studies have started paying attention to the role of intermediary figures in biopolitical projects. My research contributes to this literature by bringing the literature on biopolitics, intermediary figures, and bring in religion, particularly Islam. This is a picture in one of my sites. It's an old Anglican church in rural Tanga, but the Anglicans built a church plus a hospital and a school in the same place. To give you some context of my research methods and settings, so the findings that inform this talk are a result of 24 months of ethnographic research from 2014 to 2016 in two rural districts of Morogoro and Tanga. And in my field sites, I followed a project in Morogoro that aimed at improving family planning, knowledge and use of family planning. And in Tanga, I followed a project that worked to improve maternal and child health services. And in both these projects, they used religious leaders to enter the community. So religious leaders were recruited within a body of community representatives to be basically implementers of the project. So in both sides, I observed and participated in the key phases of the project, including recruitment of these community representatives, which also included teachers, members of the village government, retired government workers, traditional birth attendants, traditional healers. So the sheikhs were not recruited themselves. They were part of these community representative bodies. But these intermediaries, if we will call them, were given specific names. For example, in Morogoro, they were known as community health representatives, and in Tanga, they were known as community ambassadors, and they also had their Swahili labels, like wawakilishi wa afya ya jamii, mabalozi wa jamii. Now I will transition to the first part of my findings, where I give you the sense of how the project imagined Muslim religious figures. The project designers imagined that every village had an influential religious leader. This view was evident in the recruitment process. This is how it typically worked. The project staff, which included field managers, facilitators, and researchers, would visit the village government to introduce themselves, show the relevant permissions, and have a list of community representatives that they wanted to recruit. Then the village government was given the task of recruiting these community representatives. In both cases, in Morogoro and in Tanga, the project explicitly asked for viongozi wa dini, the religious leaders. I think you could relate that this mode of governance that thinks there are community leaders on the ground that could be recruited, and the need of having a group of people to connect with a larger population echoes, first treats the communities as homogeneous communities that can be accessed through kind of natural leaders that already exist. But it also echoes some Orientalist overtones that African communities or Muslim communities have to be accessed through leaders. But as I will show you next, there is some challenges on translating religious leaders, viongozi wa dini, in different religion and social contexts. So the project use of the term religious leader or viongozi wa dini was problematic, especially when it was used synonymously with sheikh. First, the term sheikh can be used to describe a wide range of roles and relationships. In Tanzania, sheikh can be a madrasa teacher, a marriage counselor, a popular and religious person, an elder, a leader, a politician, a term that recently emerged to associate politicians with the sheikh. Although sheikh were recruited by public health projects in their capacity as religious leaders, they're not the only Muslim figures in the community, nor were they the leaders in the way the project imagined. The project staff use of the term sheikh to refer to religious leader also ignored this local diversity, because they really focused on sheikh to mean religious leaders. Furthermore, the project also collapsed other distinct Muslim professional categories, such as Qadi, Ulama, Imam, Ustaz, Khatib, or Mufti, into sheikh, which means a religious figure. So project staff simplified all these religious actors into sheikh. In imagining sheikh as a religious leader, project facilitators' description of this figure came close to resemble the Weberian charismatic leader. In his work, Economy and Society, Max Weber describes charismatic leaders as individuals who can inspire, influence, lead their followers by virtue of their exceptional personal and supernatural qualities. One key quality of these charismatic leaders is their legitimacy is tied to an active population that recognizes their authority, heeds their calls, and acts based on their dictates. During training and subsequent meetings where project facilitators were constructing these religious figures, they spoke about these religious figures in a way that resembled them with charismatic figures. So one of the senior project facilitator called Monajasi said this in front of the sheikhs and other community representatives. Sheikh are closer to their followers than any other leaders. Muslims come to pray 5 times a day. The sheikh is there, who sees them and leads them in prayers. During Friday prayers, there's big crowds that come to pray. Muslim eyes and ears are directed at the sheikh. What he says, anyone can hear. No one has connection to Muslims like the sheikh. Project facilitators constructed project sheikhs as figures of authorities and as individuals with unique access to an active population. There are several reasons why it is problematic to assume that project sheikhs are these religious leaders with active following. Almost all the project sheikhs were from rural agricultural settings, and in these mainly agricultural villages, regular and widespread mosque attendance greatly varied. In most days, the congregants numbered about 5. That was on a good day. In Friday prayers, which are obligatory for Muslim men to pray, drew much larger crowds, around 20 to 25. Another aspect of project sheikhs' authority that the project facilitators imagined was their supposed oratory skills, which directly resonated with their congregants' beliefs. Project facilitators in both projects placed great weight on sheikhs' supposed ability to mold, attune, focus Muslim attention on family planning issues through their speech, which incorporates Islamic references. In one of the meetings between the community representative, which included the sheikh, Mwanajasi, this senior project facilitator, distinguished how these religious leaders' speech works differently on villages than other figures. And I'm quoting, "The good thing about the village health representative, this body that has been created, that includes the sheikh, is that you have different people working together. You can not only fill the gaps in what your fellow has said, but when the religious leaders are there, such as the sheikh and the pastors, the whole issue is given more weight. Religious figures have a way of speaking to people that resonates with their belief, and which is different from how other leaders would say." Kafupi, female project facilitator in Tanga, also repeated the same kind of ideas about religious leaders being these great orators. She described that these religious leaders are great orators, and their qualities actually come from inner dispositions. This is what she said: religious leaders do God's work, and they are God's people. They don't do blah blah. What they say is the truth and what has been prescribed in the sacred books. They are not businessmen and politicians. We need to respect them and tell them about our project the way it is. Both Kafupi and Monajasi, Kafupi is a project facilitator in Tanga, and Monajasi in Morogoro, claimed that religious leaders' oratory style was distinct in the way it resonated with people. But they never really elaborated what is so different about this speech. They made these assumptions that if religious leaders speak, it will resonate with their congregants' beliefs, with villagers' belief, and people will act on it. More importantly, they claimed that this way of speaking came from inner quality, which is truthful, uncorrupt, and religiously grounded. So I'm transitioning to the second part of my talk, where I am talking about how the Shia were evaluating themselves vis-a-vis the changes that were brought by the project. I've suggested that the Shia as a term is multifaceted and dynamic term in its local usage. But despite its fluid nature, the term Shia comes to take some specific meanings on the ground. The project Shia that I spoke with used the term to refer to specific people and specific roles that they thought fit best with that description. What follows is Hassani's own impression of his role within the project. Hassani was a project sheikh who was recruited as a sheikh in the project, and was part of this community representative body, village health representative in Morogoro. I was at his home. I met him several times during the project meetings, and I decided to go and talk to him at his home. And so I asked him about his education and how he got involved in the project. And he said, I wasn't appointed by the village. The village government called our sheikh and asked him to join the family planning project. Our sheikh is a very busy man, being one of the main sheikhs of the town, and is constantly moving. So one day he called me to his house and asked me to represent him in the project. I agreed. That's how I got to know you, Yunus. So they chose me as a sheikh, but I work at the mosque as a marriage counselor. In the meeting, the project facilitators presented Hassani to us as a religious leader, sheikh. In our conversation in his home, he said he had a small office at the Mskitwe Juma Friday Mosque, where he spoke to couples about marriage and domestic issues for 4 hours Monday to Friday. Sheikh Hassani said that there was actually an imam who was appointed by the head sheikh to lead the Farad, obligatory prayer and Friday prayers in his absence. And he never led any prayers. He didn't teach any. He didn't teach at the madrasa. Sheikh Hassani's account shows that he wasn't a sheikh that the project was imagining, an authority figure and a point of access to a population. Sheikh Hassani introduced himself to me as a marriage counselor, and actually contrasted his own identity with the imam, and also with this head sheikh that he is representing. However, Hassani never denied during the whole course of the project that he was not a sheikh. Next, I provide another example to show how project sheikh evaluated their roles and signaled how the term sheikh in their own social settings refers to specific people and roles. And I found it very odd that every time when I spoke to them outside of the project context, they will not deny that they are not sheikh, but they will point that there is some other sheikh that exists in the village. This example comes from my fieldwork in Tanga. Mbwana was a community ambassador from Maba village in Tanga, chosen as a sheikh. Late one morning we spoke as we strolled towards the mosque. We had a 3-hour project meeting where the community representatives were giving feedback on the solutions that they've designed to increase the use of maternal and child health services. I asked him a question about his Islamic education, and I replied to his responses saying, Dio Sheikh, meaning yes, Sheikh. Then he said, I'm not a Sheikh. I am Mwalimu, meaning a teacher, teaching kids Quran. I teach children Alif Ba, Arabic alphabets, and Dua, supplication, so that they can use in their prayers. My deceased father, on the other hand, was a sheikh and trained many individuals in this village. He studied his Islamic education in Pangani. Upon his return, he started a madrasa. A lot of children in this village went there for their Quranic education. This is where I also studied my basic Islamic education. Then he took several steps after that response. He looked like he was reflecting on something, and then said, I guess you people call me sheikh, I could be one, it's okay. By that time we were already in the mosque and we went for prayers. First, I didn't understand why it was so important for him to point out that he was Mwalimu wa Qur'ani and not a sheikh, because I didn't see any opposition between being a Mwalimu wa Qur'ani and a sheikh. Shembwana, like other project sheikhs before him, revealed that they had their own identities and their own roles, such as marriage counselors, or Quran teachers, or healers. They also contrasted their roles with the roles of sheikh that they knew. For example, Sheikh Mbwana contrasted his role as Mwalimu Qur'ani with his father's role as a sheikh. The point here is that Muslim figures had other identities than religious leaders that was imposed on them by the project, and they're being socially constructed as religious leaders. While they never denied their roles as religious leaders, they always referred to me to some individual in the village who fit that description. The extent that I had with Sheikh Mbwana on the way to the mosque also reveals how projects both imagine and constructs the kinds of religious authorities that they want. Louis Althusser's notion of interpellation seems apt here in describing how powerful entities like these health NGOs create subjects. Interpellation, he proposes, describes an act of individuals being identified using a label, as in calling someone then the individuals recognizing themselves as the subject of that label. Althusser's famous example of interpellation describes a police officer calling out a civilian in the public, "Hey, you there." The civilian responds and acknowledges the caller. By directing their sensory and bodily attention to the caller, they recognizing that they're the referent of the call, the civilian becomes the subject. Althusser's idea is manifest in the moment when Sheikh Mbwana recognizes that he was a subject. Both the project facilitators and I called him Sheikh in private and public interactions. I remember when Alex was talking about, we were calling youth, and they became youth. But as the detail of the walk to the mosque shows, that it was not a straightforward moment. Sheikh Mbwana went on to question my call when I was responding, Naam Sheikh, and requalified his identity by first saying, I'm not a Sheikh, I'm a Quran teacher. A moment passes, then he modifies his response, exercising his agency by saying that he could be a Sheikh, meaning he could be a Sheikh for us and the project, because we interpolated him as one. In other words, he acknowledged that he was the subject that we were referring to. In conclusion, I want to revisit the main points that I've made in this talk. Project had a certain imagination about religious leaders. This is Sheikh Mbwana. Project had a certain imagination about religious leaders and Muslim religious figures as individuals with authority, endowed with special speech abilities and access to population. And as I mentioned, I was really waiting for the project members to really elaborate what are these speech qualities that they are talking about. I also approached, one of the aspects of these speech qualities is that they are able to mold Islamic references in their speech, the Hadith or the Quran, and finding that in so many of the meetings and the activities the Sheikh implemented on the village, and they never even quoted one Hadith. It ticked me, so I went to the Sheikhs and said, hey, I kind of wanted it to see that melding of biomedical ideas and the Quran, and I said, why don't you use these Islamic references? He says public health issues are important on their own. You know, we could force this, but Muhammad, this is unnecessary. Project engaged both in imagination and constructing these figures who are authority figures, endowed with special speech abilities, and who have access to population. They didn't imagine, they just didn't imagine, but they went to construct these figures that they had, who had the qualities that they were looking for. And by doing this, they simplified how the term sheikh exists in the communities, because the sheikhs that I worked with were marriage counselors, Quran teachers, healers, politicians. But in the project meetings, we could not talk about sheikh being more than religious leaders. Like what others have shown, especially in this talk, that we cannot take for granted these categories like Islam and Muslims as these categories that are available or readily available, or stable categories to be appropriated and instrumentalized. So the project was imagining a certain kind of sheikh But when they went on the ground, this sheikh wasn't there. He had to be searched. It wasn't something that was a priori available. The term sheikh existed. The term sheikh existed also in both poles, and I think this was one of my also a revelation to me that sheikh can take such specific meanings on the ground, because I thought anybody could be a sheikh, and I think if you are in Tanzania, the term sheikh is being thrown everywhere. But going into these specific places and saying and meeting people who use it in such a specific way. So sheikh was this general and specific category within the local settings, and the interactional context is important. Individuals like Mbwana and Sheikh Hassani proclaimed their identities and contrasted with sheikhs that they knew. And I think I need to point out that this is also a story about facilitators. I'm interested in Muslims as intermediaries, but I think we're seeing a kind of layering of intermediaries here, because you have project designers who have their ideas about religious figures, but you have these project facilitators who are actually the translators of the project ideas to this body of community representatives. So most of the facilitators were from urban areas, from Dar es Salaam and Morogoro. They were college and university educated, been in the NGO arena for a while, mostly women and Christian. In fact, we only had one Muslim facilitator in the project. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.